Hi there, Rob. Another day, another slew of headlines about Manchester United and a proposed barbecue at Carrington to celebrate any Europa League triumph. There's been a recurring food pattern at Old Trafford this year with canteen cuts, now a barbecue, players not being able to get hold of as many tickets for Bilbao as they would like. Are Manchester United making a dog's dinner of their one shot at silverware in 2024-2025?
I like barbecues, particularly in the weather that we're experiencing currently. Um, got, I think the problem with Manchester United at the moment is they have had. We tend to look at the here and now, don't we? Hence the slew of headlines that we're seeing. There's some really interesting stuff come out recently about the kind of anniversary of the Glazer takeover. I think it's 20 years in, and the barbecues, the canteen cuts, the dog's dinners, whatever you want to call it, is all wrapped up in those years of essentially mismanagement. I've never been bothered about the amount of borrowing, right, that they did. Most successful businesses will borrow to some degree. The problem with Manchester United is their sporting performance has declined so significantly that it's now having an impact on all of their other operations. And by that I mean, they're sort of plateauing in revenue terms. They're having to spend more on transfers and wages to bring players in to try and become competitive. And all they're doing is throwing good money after bad and haven't sorted things out on the field. And then you kind of have this Ineos investment. And what we know about Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Ineos is they are hugely successful petrochemicals-y type company. And he's applying some of that business logic to Manchester United. So as much as it is unsavoury, pardon the pun with the food analogy, but as much as it's unsavoury for the employees and everybody associated with the football club at the moment, I genuinely think they've needed to just root and branch change what's going on. And of course, results on the field have been even worse, certainly in the Premier League. But I think they've needed this shock to try and go on to a new stage of the development of the club. Otherwise, they're going to get left behind if they haven't already.
Yeah, and I mean that game in Bilbao is shaping up to be an enormous game. With potentially historical significance in for both clubs, isn't it? Spurs and United, who incredibly, lies 17th and 16th in the Premier League. I mean, which seems ridiculous, but that has really shone a spotlight on just how massive that game in Bilbao is.
Yeah, I don't think we can understate the magnitude for either club. Actually, you rightly point out the situation they find themselves in the Premier League. The irony for both clubs is they've really struggled against English Premier League opposition because of the physicality that's associated with that. They've both done better in Europe because actually the playing styles and the lack of physicality, let's say, in that competition have enabled them to get to this position. So it could be a damp squib as a game. They could kind of cancel each other out, or somebody might fold and the other team win. In terms of prize money, the opportunity to get into the Champions League next year is the transformative income. I don't think both clubs could do with that. They could do with it from a transfer kitty perspective. They could do with it from a developmental perspective. You'd probably argue that Manchester United need it more than Spurs off the field because of all the changes that we've just talked about. But that would do a disservice for Spurs because as a club they're trying to progress. I think what we also need to remember is the Premier League in itself has become more competitive. So you have one of these bad seasons like those two clubs have had, and you find yourself in the bottom quarter of the table, whereas 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago you might have found yourself languishing around mid-table and it wouldn't have been so bad.
Yeah, I suppose the ironic thing is that with Chelsea in the Europa Conference League final, two English teams in the Europa League final, no English teams in the Champions League final, but the successes lower down that European competition are going to help massively in terms of ensuring English participation in Europe over the next few years as well, though, aren't they?
Yes, English participation in those European competitions. It's obviously better for the Premier League as a brand as well to have their clubs participating across Europe, particularly when you think about the way broadcast rights are starting to be looked at and carved up. We've got that situation in Ligue 1 where they're doing the in-house broadcast at the moment. See how that manifests itself. Everyone's going to be looking, by the way, to see whether that's successful or not, because DAZN made a a bit of a dog's dinner. Let's go back to that analogy of their broadcast rights. So the more English teams there are participating in Europe, with the bigger budgets that they have as a consequence of the prize money from teams in Europe, the better that is for sponsors, commercial partners, and ultimately gives fans good away days as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's been an incredible season at Man U. I mean, you couldn't have made up most of the stuff that's happened so far this season. Sir Jim Ratcliffe has been at the forefront of most of that. He's very much the kind of visible figure behind, the canteen cuts and all the other unpopular decisions. The Glazers, I was thinking about this on Sunday, when we saw Evangelos Mariakis, bursting onto the pitch and having a go at Nuno at the final whistle of the Forest game at Leicester. I wonder if Man U fans are looking at that thinking, wow, there's an owner with passion, there's an owner who really cares deeply about his team. Here's an owner who's spent his own money, is promising a brand new stadium, which isn't going to financially cripple the club, and he's bought success and European qualification to Forest for the first time in a generation. I wonder if Man U fans are looking at that thinking, well, I wouldn't mind a bit of that guy, sweeping into Old Trafford, and showing that kind of passion. Because if there's one thing that Manchester United fans absolutely hate, it's not just the Glazers, it's the fact that they're invisible.
Yeah, there's a level of the PR machine gearing up and then slowing down when it needs to, and that invisibility that you've just referred to there, I think is quite important. When the chips are down, the ownership kind of disappear, don't they? And it's been interesting to see the number of interviews that Ruben Amorim has had to do, because part of me thinks, well, sporting directors should really be fronting up and doing a bit of that. Of course, they got rid of Dan Ashworth not so long ago, so maybe somebody from the ownership group should be stepping in. But I suspect there's been a little bit of a fallout behind the scenes with some of the comments that Sir Jim made at Christmas when he said that United were going to run out of money and they had no cash flow, which was stretching the truth to somebody that looks at the balance sheet and the profit and loss account of the football club. Marinakis doesn't have the pockets, I guess, to buy a club like Manchester United. And we also needn't forget that actually Nottingham Forest propelled themselves into Europe through some rather excessive spending that breached profit and sustainability rules not so long ago. I wonder actually whether there is an element of that that's going through the minds of some of these owners at the top end of the Premier League, that actually, should they worry about PSR, should they take a little points deduction like Forest have done, because the net gain over the course of this season for Forest has been, nothing short of miraculous. They'll earn upwards of 60 million if they get into in Europe. They'll earn upwards of 100 million if they're able to break into those Champions League places. So it kind of covers up a little bit of a PSR breach and a couple of points that they had deducted from them the other season, doesn't it? But certainly he's a big character, and I'm not so sure Nuno would have been overly happy with the rampaging owner on the pitch at the weekend.
I thought he took it very well, actually.
I don't think Sir Jim Ratcliffe will be doing that with Amorim. I just like to see it.
Yeah. Well, I'd fancy Marinakis in a sprint race against Sir Jim. Well, it wouldn't be...
he's a marathon man, isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be a dust-up, that's for sure.
But we are obviously towards now the real tail end of the season, but there is still a lot to play for. Forest have got a massive weekend coming up, haven't they? And then, of course, we've got the FA Cup final, and then the Europa League and the Conference League finals as well. So there is still a lot on the line, isn't there?
Huge amount on the line. Got to finish off those European places. There are trophies to be won. There are seasons to save. Going back to the Manchester United Tottenham Hotspur thing, there are seasons to try and finish off for clubs like Chelsea. Some really, really big games, and then of course you weigh in the Championship playoff final in all of that as well, and the £100+ million game that becomes. Team that's fairly local to me, of course, making it through against Bristol City, and it'll be interesting to see whether they can go with form which is that any club in receipt of parachute payments, as I think I've told you before, 3 times more likely to be re-promoted. So shouldn't be any surprise that Sheffield United are in that final already, and the odds say they are much more likely to go up than anybody else.
And I'm based near Southampton, Rob, and I can tell you there's a lot of Saints fans that are relieved that they're going to be watching their team in the Championship rather than the Premier League next season.
It's no fun seeing your team get beat, is it?
No, well, I wonder what most Sheffield United supporters would prefer. I mean, it's great, isn't it? And you look at the headlines and you look at those headline figures and 100 million and, guaranteed parachute payments, even though they're already in receipt of them. But that doesn't, to the average fan, if you're going out there and watching, Manchester City 6, Sheffield United 0 every weekend, then that's not a whole lot of fun, is it?
It's not. I think it really, and I don't know the inner workings of either of those clubs we've just mentioned, but you would hope that they have these kind of longer term strategies to try and propel themselves into a consistent Premier League spot. And actually that's where the shorter term stuff, so Southampton getting hammered this year, might be part of a 3 to 5 year strategy that actually allows them to build next year, hopefully get re-promoted, might even come back down. Those kind of yo-yo clubs that we used to talk about 10 years or so ago are becoming much more prevalent now, and I think you need to really plan over that 5-6 year period, invest really carefully, don't blow budgets just to try and maintain your position, albeit, going back to Forest, that's what they did, and they managed to stay up. But I think you've got to take a much longer term view on it, and for fans it's kind of quite difficult to stay on board with that, because you watch your team getting hammered every week in the Premier League and then they win every week when they're in the Championship. So it's, season on, season off stuff can't be that encouraging, particularly when you're spending a lot of money to go.
Worst case scenario, say Man U lost the Champions League final, finish 17th, which would be their worst finish since they were relegated in the 70s. Do you think there'll be people in the corridors of power at Old Trafford who will actually be more concerned with being relegated from the Premier League next season than actually challenging for Europe?
That's an interesting question. So I'm going to go back to what we started inferring earlier. I think Manchester United have really had to draw a line in the sand to say, this is what's gone before. We cannot keep rinsing and repeating this cycle, because all they've done is brought manager in, supported manager with player transfers. Those player transfers have never quite been up to it, but have been very, very costly. And then you just rinse and repeat. It's the same with what happened with Ten Hag most recently. I think the big difference for me with the appointment of Amorim is that they've said, we are going to change the culture, the environment and the playing style of this squad. It is much more akin to what I think we saw when Sir Alex Ferguson took over in the early 80s from Ron Atkinson, and they experienced that period of significant decline. I think they were, and I was looking back at some of the comments that he made after the Ipswich game, where he talked about, we have to stay true to these principles, because what we have been doing is putting teams out to be competitive on the field, but never really getting the results we've wanted. Our positions have been fine, 6th, 7th, 8th in the league, maybe a scrape into European competition. But ultimately, fans at that football club, myself included, want to see them challenging for the Premier League, and they've been nowhere near that for a long time. So you have to do something that is so different, that gives the system a shock, that might be able to deliver that Premier League competition. So to answer your question, I think they will be deeply concerned about what's happened in the Premier League this year. But I think the plans they will have been putting in place with Ruben, with Jason Wilcox, with that back of house team, on how they strengthen this summer, will be really, really important. If they win the Europa League, I think that makes life easier, because it means they've got a bigger cash flow coming in next year, so they can start competing on those transfer fees and those wages that they will inevitably have to spend. They've got a lot of transfer fees still outstanding, so that cash injection is going to be really important. I think the executives will start to get more concerned sort of Christmas time if results don't see a significant uptick from what we've seen this year. If they can finish top 6 next year, which will have to be the goal, then I think what Amorim's doing is probably the direction of travel that the club is rightfully going in, because you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. The big gamble, of course, for Manchester United is they're moving from a 4-2-3-1 system to a 3-4-3 or hybrid of that under him. If it doesn't work, what do they do next? Do they go back to that, Ten Hag, Mourinho, Van Gaal style management, or do they then go to the next iteration of Ruben Amorim? Because the reality is, you're going to be signing players for a system manager this year, and if they choose to do a different system next time, forget Manchester United competing for another decade, as far as I'm concerned.
And if you look at it, if you take it as on the whole, if you look at it in the round across Europe, it's now at the point where you're struggling to find a parallel between Manchester United's decline and any other club in the, Ajax, for example, in the Dutch league was struggling 2 or 3 years ago and were battling relegation rather than going for the top. But if you look at Spain, you've got Madrid, Atletico, Barcelona year on year, Bilbao. If you look in France, it's PSG constantly. Bayern Munich have won the Bundesliga again. It's hard to find a parallel of a club of the size and the magnitude of Manchester United, which, let's face it, across Europe there are very few that has endured what is now if you're on the outside looking in, you would say it was despite the Europa League final, it looks like a terminal decline, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's two things there. So if you put Manchester United in any one of those leagues you just mentioned, they wouldn't be struggling in the same way that they are doing now because of their sheer size and scale. So I think what we need to remember is in each of those other leagues in Europe, there is simply no real discernible competition for clubs of that ilk. So you have a bad season, you bounce back the following year. Ajax is a good example of that. When Juventus got their relegation in Serie A because of the corruption charges, they bounced straight back and won titles. You've got Bayern Munich, who hiccuped last year against Leverkusen, but that's back to what we would expect. And of course, we see what we see in France, and we also see what we see in Spain. So put Manchester United in any of those leagues, there's no problem. They are going to be up in those top places. The big challenge you've got in the Premier League, because of the fueling of the TV cash and these clubs that have managed to break into Europe when we hadn't necessarily expected them to be able to do it, is the Premier League is now much more competitive, without having statistically proven it yet, much more competitive than it ever has been. So that makes the scale of Manchester United's challenge much more acute, because Brentford are spending money, Brighton spend money, Nottingham Forest have spent money, Chelsea have spent a huge amount of money, and so on and so forth. So breaking back into that group of top 8, top 10 clubs is not an easy feat in any way, shape or form. Money always makes things a little bit easier. So again, go back to, if they're able to win the Europa League, then the money that's on offer next year will certainly help them with their cause. What we should also not forget is, whilst their Premier League form has been really quite ordinary, I think they've won as many trophies as their nearest competitor, which is probably Man City over the last 5 years. Carabao Cup, FA Cup. I think they've been in a couple of finals as well. So in those one-off competitions, they've actually not performed too badly. And this year might be the same with the Europa League. Let's see. They'll certainly be hoping Spurs are Spursy, put it that way, next week.
Well, it's hugely ironic, isn't it? There's these two teams in a final, and I don't think there'll be many other instances where you would go into a final with both sets of fans preparing to watch it from behind the sofa.
That's a fair shout, including me, probably.
Yeah.